Ghostly tales, yet mirrors of human life. Hey everyone! Welcome to Encountering Chinese. Ghostly Tales from Zhai. Today, I'm going to tell you a story called Gong Mengbi. In Baoding, there was a man named Liu Fanghua. He was wealthy and generous, often hosting gatherings where he invited hundreds of guests. Liu Fanghua was known for helping others in their times of need, and he didn't hesitate to spend large sums of money, even up to 1,000 silver coins. Guests and friends often borrowed money from him, and many times, they didn't return it, but Liu Fanghua didn't mind. There was only one guest named Gong Mengbi, a man from Shaanxi, who never asked for anything from the Liu family. Whenever he visited, he usually stayed for a year. Gong Mengbi was eloquent, so Liu Fanghua enjoyed spending the most time with him, engaging in long conversations. Liu Fanghua had a son named Liuha, who was still a child. He called Gong Mengbi uncle, and Gong Mengbi enjoyed playing games with Liuha. Whenever Liuha returned home from his private school, Gong Mengbi and he would lift the floor tiles, pretending that the stones were treasures of gold and silver buried underneath, making it their game of joy. Liu Fanghua's house, with 5 buildings, had stones buried in front and behind every house. People often mocked them for their childish behavior, but Liuha, in particular, liked Gong Mengbi, and their relationship was closer than with other guests. More than 10 years later, Liu Fanghua's wealth gradually depleted, unable to meet the demands of so many guests, resulting in a decrease in their numbers. Nevertheless, gatherings with over a dozen people throughout the night still occurred frequently. As Liu Fanghua aged, the family's fortunes declined further. However, he managed to acquire some money by selling off land to sustain their daily needs. Liuha, like his father, was prodigal with money. He also befriended some young men, imitating his father's behavior, and surprisingly, Liu Fanghua never interfered. Soon after, Liu Fanghua passed away, and the family was so impoverished that they couldn't even afford a coffin. In response, Gong Mengbi used his own money to handle Liu Fanghua's funeral arrangements. Grateful for this, Liuha entrusted Gong Mengbi with all matters, big and small, in the household. Every time Gong Mengbi returned home, his sleeves were sure to contain a few pieces of rubble, which he discreetly threw into a hidden place upon arriving. No one knew the purpose of this peculiar behavior. Liuha often sat with Gong Mengbi, expressing concern about their impoverished circumstances. Gong Mengbi would console him, saying, "You don't understand the hardships of life. Not to mention the lack of money now, even if I gave you 1,000 silver coins immediately, you'd spend it all in no time. Men fear not being self-reliant, why should they fear poverty?" One day, Gong Mengbi prepared to return to his hometown and bid farewell to Liuha. Tearfully, Liuha urged him to come back soon, and Gong Mengbi promised before leaving the Liu household. Subsequently, Liuha's situation worsened, to the point where he couldn't even sustain his livelihood. Everything of value in the Liu household had already been pawned. Liuhe anxiously awaited Gong Mengbi's return to help him manage the crumbling family estate. However, Gong Mengbi disappeared without a trace, leaving no information behind, like the vanished yellow crane, never to return. Initially, when Liu Fanghua was alive, he had arranged a marriage for his son Liuhe with the daughter of the wealthy Huang family in Wuji County. Later, upon hearing about the financial difficulties of the Liu family, Huang regretted the alliance secretly. When the announcement of Liu Fanghua's death reached Huang's house, he did not express condolences. Liuhe believed Huang might be hindered by the distant journey and transportation difficulties, so he forgave him. After completing the mourning period for his father, Liuhe was instructed by his mother to visit the prospective in-laws, hoping to finalize the wedding date and seek assistance from the Huang family in their time of misfortune. However, upon arrival at the Huang residence, Huang, having learned that Liuhe wore tattered clothes and worn-out shoes, ordered the gatekeeper not to let him in. Huang conveyed a message to Liuhe, stating, "If you can bring back 100 taels of silver, you may return, otherwise, the engagement is permanently cancelled." Hearing this, Liuhe burst into tears. Living across from Huang's house was an elderly woman named Lu, who pitied Liuhe's plight. She invited him to her home for a meal and, upon his departure, gave him 300 coins as well as words of comfort, advising him to go back. Returning home, Liuhe shared the cold treatment he received at his prospective father-in-law's house with his mother, causing her great sorrow and anger. She thought of the past debts owed by guests who hadn't repaid them and urged Liuhe to seek help from some wealthy acquaintances. Helplessly, Liuhe explained, "Those who befriended us back then were drawn by our family wealth. If I were to arrive in a luxurious carriage, pulled by 4 horses, seeking a loan, even 1,000 taels of silver wouldn't be difficult to obtain. However, given our current circumstances, who would still think of past favors and remember old friendships? Moreover, when my father lent money, there were never promissory notes or guarantors. Now, in attempting to collect debts, we lack any evidence." Despite Liuhe's reservations, his mother insisted he try. Reluctantly, he complied. Liuhe visited various acquaintances, pleading for help, but after more than 20 days of debt collection efforts, he returned home empty-handed. Only one person, a performer named Li Si, who had received kindness from the Liu family in the past, heard about their predicament and generously sent 1 tael of silver. Mother and son wept bitterly, realizing that their hopes had been extinguished. Back to the rich merchant Huang's daughter, Miss Huang. She had reached the age to be married and, hearing that her father had rejected the proposal from Liuhe, felt dissatisfied with his decision. Huang intended to marry his daughter off to someone else. Tearfully, the daughter said to her father, "Liuhe was not born into poverty. Even if he is wealthier now than before, wouldn't there still be enemies trying to take him away from us? Yet today, we are abandoning him just because he is poor. It's truly heartless and unjust." Huang was displeased with his daughter's attitude and tried to persuade her in various ways, but she remained steadfast in her stance. Huang and his wife were furious and spent the whole day cursing and spitting at their daughter. Surprisingly, she endured it all calmly. Not long after, one night, the Huang family fell victim to thieves who ransacked their home. Huang and his wife were subjected to torture and nearly lost their lives. Their wealth was completely plundered. Unexpectedly, 3 years later, the Huang family's fortunes deteriorated even further. A businessman from the West heard of the beauty of Miss Huang and was willing to offer 50 taels of silver as a dowry to marry her. Driven by greed, Huang readily agreed and planned to force his daughter to marry the businessman. After discovering their plot, Miss Huang tore her clothes, smudged her face, and escaped from the Huang family in the darkness of the night. She begged for alms along the way, enduring 2 months of hardships until she finally arrived in Baoding. Upon learning the address of Liuhe's home, she disregarded the customary rituals for a new bride entering her husband's family and went directly to Liuhe's house. Initially, Liu's mother thought she was a beggar and intended to chase her away. However, Miss Huang, sobbing, narrated her story, and Liu's mother, weeping, held her hand, saying, "Poor child. How did you end up in such a wretched state?" So, Miss Huang sorrowfully shared with Liu's mother the story of being compelled to disguise herself, smearing her face, and escaping from her home. Upon hearing her tale, Liuhe and his mother were deeply moved and allowed her to cleanse herself. When they saw her after the bath, they discovered Miss Huang was stunningly beautiful, which delighted both Liu and his mother. However, the Liu family was extremely impoverished, and Miss Huang's arrival meant the family of 3 could only afford 1 meal a day. Weeping, Liu's mother said to her daughter-in-law, "We, mother and son, endure poverty as it is our lot, but it's truly unfortunate for you. My dear daughter-in-law, enduring hardships here in our Liu family." Miss Huang comforted Liu's mother with a smile, saying, "I once lived among beggars, and I'm more familiar with the life of a beggar than you can imagine. Compared to then, our situation now feels like the difference between heaven and hell." Liu's mother, hearing this, finally smiled in relief. One day, Miss Huang visited the vacant old house of the Liu family and found overgrown weeds everywhere with no clear space. She slowly entered the interior and discovered thick layers of dust, and in the dim corner of the wall, it seemed like something was piled up. When she kicked it with her foot, it hurt, and picking up a piece, she was astonished to find it was high-quality silver. Amazed, she hurried back to inform Liuhe. Following her, Liuhe went to investigate. To their surprise, the silver pieces were remnants that Uncle Gong had brought back in his sleeves and abandoned in the dark corners, which had now turned into pure silver. This reminded Liuhe of the times he used to bury stones under the floor tiles of the old house with Uncle Gong during his childhood. Worried that those stones might also have turned into silver, Liuhe promptly redeemed the old house, which had been mortgaged to creditors. Liuhe discovered that the old house's floor tiles were already broken and incomplete, and the stones buried years ago were exposed and visible, feeling somewhat disappointed. However, when he lifted other floor tiles, he was astonished to find piles of shiny silver underneath. In an instant, the Liu family became wealthy once again. They redeemed the mortgaged fields, hired servants, and their mansion surpassed its former grandeur. After such a tumultuous experience, Liu began to motivate himself. He said to himself, "If I don't stand on my own feet now, I would be letting down Uncle Gong's sincere efforts for my family." From then on, he devoted himself to studying. 3 years later, he was chosen as the intellectual and moral model of the town. Even after regaining wealth, Liu didn't forget his benefactor. He personally went to express gratitude to Mrs. Liu, the kind old lady living across from the Huang family. Liu, dressed in splendid attire, accompanied by over 10 servants, all riding tall horses, arrived grandiosely at Mrs. Liu's house. Mrs. Liu's house was very small, with only one room. Liu sat on her bed and chatted with her. Meanwhile, the noisy arrival of Liu and his entourage created a commotion in the narrow alley. Since Miss Huang ran away, the wealthy man who intended to marry Miss Huang pressured the Huang family to return the betrothal gifts. However, the dowry had already been spent by the Huang couple, and they couldn't repay the full amount. In desperation, Huang had to sell their house to settle the debt. From then on, the Huang family became as destitute as the Liu family in the past. Hearing about Liu's newfound prosperity, Huang felt deep regret, closed his door, and sank into sorrow. Mrs. Liu bought wine and dishes to entertain Liu. During the conversation, she spoke highly of the virtue of the Huang family's daughter and expressed regret about her disappearance. Mrs. Liu asked Liu if he had married, and he replied that he already had a wife. After the meal, Liu insisted on taking Mrs. Liu to see his new wife. They returned to Baoding together. As they entered the gate of Liu's house, Miss Huang, dressed in her best attire, came out to greet them, surrounded by a group of maids like a celestial being. Mrs. Liu was surprised to see Miss Huang in such a state. They held hands and reminisced about the past, and Miss Huang eagerly inquired about her parents' well-being. Mrs. Liu stayed at the Liu family's house for a few days, receiving generous hospitality from the entire family. Liu arranged for a tailor to make a beautiful outfit for Mrs. Liu, who was then dressed up from head to toe. Reluctantly, Liu bid farewell and escorted her back home. Upon Mrs. Liu's return home, she hurried to the neighboring Huang family and reported the situation of Miss Huang, conveying her greetings. The Huang couple was astonished upon hearing the news. Mrs. Liu advised them to seek refuge with their daughter, but she noticed a hesitant expression on Huang's face. Shortly after, due to unbearable hunger and cold, Mr. Huang arrived in Baoding hoping to reunite with his daughter. Standing before the grand and ornate gate of the residence, he hesitated to knock as the guards stared sternly. Huang dared not knock on the door and waited outside the gate for a whole day. The guards noticed him but did not report his presence. In the evening, a woman emerged from within the gate. Huang approached with a smiling face, spoke kind words, revealed his name, and requested the woman to convey a message to his daughter discreetly. After a while, the woman returned and discreetly led him inside. They entered a small room beside the main hall, where the woman informed Huang. "Madam wishes to meet you immediately. but it's risky if my master finds out. We must wait for the right moment. Sir, when did you arrive? Are you hungry? Huang recounted his arduous journey to the woman. She then brought him a pot of wine and 2 plates of food. Handing him 5 taels of silver, she said, "My master is currently hosting guests in the hall, and Madam may not have the opportunity to come out. Leave early tomorrow morning, and make sure not to be discovered by the master." Mr. Huang agreed. Early the next morning, Huang packed his belongings and went to his daughter's door. Finding it still closed, he waited in the doorway, sitting on his luggage. Suddenly, a commotion arose, and voices were heard saying that the master was about to leave. Huang, thinking to pick up his luggage and quickly retreat, was already seen by Liuhe. Perplexed, Liuhe inquired about the stranger, but none of the household members could provide an answer. Annoyed, Liuhe exclaimed, "Intruding into someone else's home, he must be a troublemaker. Quickly tie him up and take him to the yamen for me." The family members, in unison, bound him securely with a short rope and tied him to a tree in the courtyard. Huang, feeling ashamed and frightened, did not offer a single word in his defense. At that moment, the woman from the previous day rushed out, kneeling before Liuhe, and explained, "This man is my uncle. Because he arrived late yesterday, I didn't have time to report it to the master." Only then did Liuhe order the servants to release him. The woman escorted Huang outside, apologizing for the oversight. She also suggested a solution, saying, "It's all my fault for forgetting to inform the gatekeeper, leading to such an incident. Madam said that if you want her, you can have Mrs. Huang pretend to be a flower seller and come with Mrs. Liu, our neighbor across the street." Mr. Huang, expressing gratitude, agreed and left. Back at home, he recounted all his experiences to his wife. Mrs. Huang, yearning for her daughter as if starving, sought the help of Mrs. Liu. Mrs. Liu readily agreed to accompany her on a visit to Liuhe's residence. The 2 elderly ladies entered the courtyard of Liuhe's residence, passing through more than 10 gates before reaching the place where the daughter lived. They saw Miss Huang adorned in a gorgeous attire, wearing a high hair bun, adorned with luxurious fabrics, and the room was filled with a delightful fragrance. At her slightest command, the maids and servants hurriedly gathered around her, bringing golden lacquered chairs and bamboo tables to cool the air. Through subtle exchanges in their own language, the mother and daughter greeted each other, their eyes meeting, and tears welled up in their eyes. At night, the maids prepared a guest room for the 2 old ladies. The bedding was light and soft, a luxury even during the prosperous days of the Huang family. The 2 old ladies stayed at Liu's house for about 3 to 5 days, and Miss Huang treated them with great warmth. Whenever there were no others around, Mrs. Huang would tearfully confess her past mistakes. Miss Huang would console her, saying, "What unresolved issues are there between us, mother and daughter? It's just that Liuhe is still holding a grudge, so I dare not let him know everything." After that, every time Liuhe returned home, Mrs. Huang would hurriedly retreat and hide. One day, While Miss Huang and Mother were having a heart-to-heart talk in bed, Liuhe suddenly walked in. Seeing this situation, he angrily shouted, "You, old woman from the countryside, what audacity! How dare you sit together with my wife? I should shave off all your hair." Mrs. Liu hurriedly stepped forward to explain. "This old lady is a familiar acquaintance of mine, Mrs. Wang, who sells flowers. Please don't blame her." Liuhe calmed down, apologized, and, after sitting down, said to Mrs. Liu, "You've been here for several days. I've been too busy to find time to chat with you properly. I wonder how those two old animals from the Huang family are doing." Mrs. Liu smiled and replied, "They are doing fine, just struggling with extreme poverty. Sir, now that you are wealthy and prosperous, why not consider your relationship with the Huang family?" Liuhe, slapping the table, exclaimed, "If it weren't for your old kindness in giving me a bowl of porridge back then, how could I have returned to my hometown alive? Just thinking about it, I really want to skin them and sit on it. What relationship can I possibly have with them?" He scolded vehemently, even stomping his feet. Miss Huang, feeling angry, said to Liuhe, "Even if they are unkind and unjust, they are still my parents. I endured the long journey, my hands covered in frostbite, and my toes wearing through my shoes. I believe I haven't done anything wrong to you. Why do you insult my parents in front of others? Are you intentionally embarrassing me?" Liuhe realized he had gone too far, so he suppressed his anger, stood up, and left. After hearing the words from Liuhe, Mrs. Huang felt ashamed and remorseful, utterly humiliated. She decided to leave immediately, and before departing, Miss Huang secretly gave her 20 taels of silver. Back home, with no news from the Huang couple, Miss Huang was particularly concerned about them. Sympathizing with his wife's distress, Liuhe sent someone to invite them to Baoding. When the Huang couple arrived at Liu's residence, they couldn't lift their heads due to shame. Liuhe apologized, saying, "I hadn't met the elderly couple before. Last year, you came a long way without explaining your identity, and I truly offended you." Huang responded only with a low, embarrassed voice. Liuhe then provided the Huang couple with new clothes and shoes. Despite staying at Liu's house for over a month, the Huang couple still felt uneasy and wanted to bid farewell and return home. Seeing their determination to leave, Liuhe did not insist on them staying. Before their departure, Liuhe gifted them 100 taels of silver, saying, "Back then, that wealthy merchant offered 50 taels to marry your daughter. Today, I'll double that and use 100 taels to marry your daughter." Mr. Huang accepted the gesture with great shame. Liuhe arranged for transportation to send them back to their hometown. With this money, their later years could be considered comfortable. At the end of the story, the author provides the following commentary. After the decline of a wealthy family, former guests will disappear, which is truly infuriating. One might feel inclined to tightly close the doors and have no intention of making connections with any guests ever again. However, There are friends like Gong Mengbi who generously contribute funds for the burial of the deceased, transforming stones into gold to aid the living. This can also be seen as a repayment to those who are generous and hospitable. A woman who can enjoy wealth and glory with her husband, akin to an imperial concubine in a royal palace, if not as virtuous and steadfast as someone like Miss Huang, who else can peacefully enjoy such prosperity without feeling unworthy? The Creator does not bestow blessings arbitrarily, and this story should illustrate that point. It reminds me of another story I heard before. In the past, in a certain village, there was a wealthy man who hoarded every bit of wealth, accumulating fortunes meticulously. He buried hundreds of taels of silver underground, fearing discovery by others. He intentionally dressed in tattered clothes, appearing impoverished, and demonstrated extreme poverty by eating coarse grains and wild vegetables. When relatives and friends occasionally visited, he never slaughtered chickens or prepared meals for them. If anyone dared to suggest that he wasn't poor, he would glare with eyes full of anger, as if harboring an irreconcilable hatred. In his later years, this wealthy man continued to eat only a piece of elm bark every day, growing so thin that the skin on his arms hung down over an inch. Despite this, he refused to use the silver buried underground. Eventually, in his weakened state, facing imminent death, his two sons surrounded him, asking about the location of the hidden silver. However, the rich man was unwilling to tell them immediately. It wasn't until he realized his death was imminent that he wanted to disclose the burial location. But when his sons gathered around, he found himself unable to speak, only clawing at his chest and making incoherent sounds. As a result, after the rich man's death, his descendants still couldn't afford a coffin for him, hastily burying his body with straw mats. This illustrates that if one considers buried silver in the house as wealth, then why can't the national treasury with millions of gold coins be considered one's own fortune? Truly foolish. Alright. That's all for today's ghostly tale. Gong Mengbi. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Please also encourage everyone to comment and share more. We'll see you in the next episode.